Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our third Digital Talk, an event organized by Òmnium Cultural, a Barcelona-based NGO dealing with culture and civil rights. My name is Alex Miquel and I am the head of communications of the International Department in Òmnium, and I'll be moderating this event. And in this third Digital Talk, we will try to answer this question. Will a fractured European Union survive the challenges of COVID-19? In the last few months, there has been much talk about the role of the European Union with regard to the handling of the coronavirus crisis. And more recently, we have seen the difficulties that EU member states are having to agree on a recovery fund for the COVID-19 crisis. So how all this will impact on the future of the Union? To talk about this interesting topic, we are delighted to have with us experts in the ever-present European debate. And we are pleased to welcome Carme Colomina, researcher and editor at Cidob and visiting professor at College Europe. Good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon.
And Corina Stratulat, head of European Politics and Institutions Program. Good afternoon, Corina.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation.
And Whyte, senior director in APCO Global Solutions. Good afternoon, Nicholas.
Good afternoon, Alex. Very glad to be with you.
And unfortunately, and due to an unforeseen last-minute commitment, Heath, senior editor in Politico, won't be able to be with us today. But we are sure that we are going to invite him again to listen to his thoughts about the future of Europe. That said, and before giving the floor to our panelists, we want to thank our viewers on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter for staying with us today. As usual, we encourage you to send questions to our speakers during the show. And at the end of the session, our guests will try to answer some of your questions. How can you send us your questions? Easy. On YouTube, you can do it by writing your question in our live chat. On Facebook and Twitter, you can comment on this event post or tweet. And you can also send us a direct message via our social media channels. And without further ado, let's get started. Our first guest is Carme Colomina. She's a research fellow on European Union, Disinformation and Global Politics at Cidob, Barcelona Center for International Affairs. She's also a visiting professor at College of Europe in Bruges, Belgium, and a weekly contributor to Barcelona-based newspaper ARA, as well as to other media. She has been Brussels correspondent and head of international affairs in Catalunya Radio and ARA. And as a special envoy, she covered dozens of international summits and political conflicts. She recently coordinated, together with Daniel Innerarity, Desinformación y Poder, Spanish for Disinformation and Power, a collaborative issue of the journal Afers Internacionals, International Affairs, Cidob, 124, where they published the article La verdad en las democracias algorítmicas, analyzing the democratic challenges of disinformation. Carme Colomina will be speaking to us from Barcelona. Whenever you're ready, Carme.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, and thank you to Òmnium and to all those who are already following us. So it's a very wide question, the one that you are asking to us to summarize in 8 minutes, and I will try to do my best, and then we can go to the debate. But my feeling is that every new crisis that the EU is encountering and going on sits on the legacies and on the fractures of all the previous crises. So part of the rhetorics, the divides, and the initial "my country first" reaction that we saw in the first moments of these pandemics were developing already from previous confrontations. So the difference now, I think, is that the COVID-19 crisis has brought really an acceleration of all those previous existing trends, and it has added new ones probably. So what we see these days is that there is an acceleration of the internal asymmetries and inequalities. So there were asymmetries in the outbreak of the pandemics because it didn't affect in the same way all the EU countries, but also it will be inequalities or asymmetries in the possibilities to come out of this crisis. Who will be better equipped? Probably there won't be the same for all the member states, so that will enlarge already existing inequalities. I think there will be an acceleration probably on the international clashes, and we have seen already some examples that they can go on and on in the next months. For instance, we saw the decision of the German Constitutional Court challenging the EU or the European Justice Court. So that would be one. But we have also seen the European Court of Justice prohibiting some Hungarian laws last week. We've seen also the strengthened role of the European Central Bank. So my feeling is that we could also envisage some new institutional clashing for the near future. And then also there has been an acceleration of the power grab and the erosion of civic rights in some member states, clearly with the excuse or using the pandemic as an excuse for challenging the democratic processes in some member states. The digitalization of the global order has also brought new troubles for the EU, and I will mention that also later. So all these new challenges are already happening in a already fragmented European Union. So what can we expect of this new context where the consensus of what the EU is or what the EU should be was already broken, if we take into account what has been happening in the last times and how the EU has evolved in these last years, and how what every member state expects from the European Union is not the same anymore. So I think there has been also a widening distance between member states and what they expect of the European project. And this will develop and even go further in the next months. And it's also bringing even more uncertainty. During the COVID-19, we had troubles to have the right answers on how to respond to the pandemics and how to respond to the challenge that it was affecting the survival of the EU citizens. But also we have to understand that this is all happening in a period of politics of emotions, when belonging, for instance, is more related to individual experiences than to big narratives. So the COVID crisis brings even more uncertainty and more, I think, and more stress on these individual feelings of what the EU means for every one of us, and what the EU, who is protecting us in this moment of emergency as the one that we've gone through. So, okay, at the same time, I think that there have been some lessons learned from my point of view on the way the European Commission reacts. For instance, if we compare to the financial crisis in 2008, I think that after a few weeks really of knocking down and not knowing how to react, we could see the President Ursula von der Leyen reacting, even asking for forgiveness to the Italians in the European Parliament. We've seen some bold proposals from my point of view on the table also that would bring really a leap forward on the economic and political integration. This is why they will be very difficult to be approved, and we can discuss probably this with my partners here in this debate. But at the end, so that's also one of the reasons that probably can make us think on, again, these institutional clashings between some member states and also the European institutions. Okay, so that will be for the internal page and the internal challenges. But I think that the survival of the European Union is not only an internal matter, because the global narrative of the pandemic has been formulated also in the form of defining dilemmas about political models, that they are directly challenging the EU global vision of multilateralism and a rule-based world. So that's also a defining challenge for the European Union, not only because of these internal pressures, but also the external ones, because the world is reorganizing in a way where the European rule-based model is having also troubles to fit in and to find allies. It used to be China for a convenience period, let's say, in the last times, but now that the relations with China has been really much damaged because of the pandemics, I think this is also bringing some more vulnerabilities to the European Union as a global actor to defend and to find alliances to defend their vision of the world. And this is also, from my point of view, challenging the future survival of the European Union as such, because we've seen this clash of views among those who defend a collective solution for the pandemics, even taking into account the vulnerabilities and the criticisms that big organizations such the WHO or the United Nations have had during this month. But also there is a clash among them and those advocating for a global withdrawal and for a reinforcement of the state's power as a solution, a so-called solution to better protect citizens, because this is one of the reactions we've seen. And there has been also an acceleration of this new digital surveillance and social control of the citizens model to isolate the virus, and the very European debate of the right to privacy and to personal data. And this is also changing. I mean, what this means is that the entourage, the world is changing around the European Union, and this is also affecting, let's say, the survival of the model of the European Union. So, okay, the EU is now caught in this systemic rivalry between the US and China, and it's also facing endogenous forces inside, putting pressure to the model. And Brexit is one clear, but there are others like illiberalism, like the crisis of the traditional party systems, that the populism probably. This is all eroding internal consensus on what the EU can expect for the next time. So I think that's one of the challenges that brings me to my conclusion in so far, and then we will debate about it. But I think that every time is, from my point of view, more and more difficult to imagine how the EU or this European Union can survive as it is, can survive from this statu quo. What I have the feeling is that the EU will survive while evolving, or while the nature of it will be changing. How will this change be defining the European model? How the values that define the European model will be even more damages in this evolution or not? I think that's one of the big questions.
Thank you very much, Karma.
Thank you.
And above all, for raising these insightful points. And now I'm glad to introduce Corina Stratulat. She's a senior policy analyst and the head of European Politics and Institutions program. Her work at the EPC focuses on EU institutional developments and enlargement towards the Balkans. She holds an MPhil in Contemporary European Studies from the University of Cambridge, UK, and a PhD in Political and Social Sciences from the European University Institute, Italy. Her main research interests include comparative Central and East European politics, parties and party systems, elections, democracy, populism, EU institutions, the Balkans' EU integration and enlargement policy. Carina Strata will speak to us from Brussels. The floor is yours, Corina.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I had to unmute myself. Thank you very much for this rather detailed but kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here with you today, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this debate. Will a fractured EU survive the challenges of COVID-19? To answer your question, I thought I would make three different remarks. The first one links a little bit with the intervention of the previous speaker, and in actually focusing on the challenges of COVID-19 part of your question, which I think in many respects are indeed, as we've already heard, a culmination of all previous crises. COVID-19 has put the polycrisis of the past decade on steroids, so to say, and I think the impact promises to be devastating. The economy, the single market, Schengen, liberal democracy, all have taken a particularly hard hit now, but it is important to emphasize that we already knew that these policy areas were vulnerable points which had previously tested the Union already with some basic questions about how it can function. So what we are seeing then, to a large extent, is ghosts of crisis past, as old structural problems are rearing their heads again. And from this perspective, what coronavirus did was to remind us that we cannot run away forever from our fundamental dilemmas. At some point, we have to look fear in the eye and decide that we will do whatever it takes. I mean, whatever it takes to get in better shape. That is, be open to challenge what we know, how we do things, and be willing to change if we need to. Now, can the Union survive if we fail to do so? I think that, yes, it's possible. After all, the EU has managed to survive so far by kicking the can down the road over and over again. And to be sure, by progressing incrementally and step by step, the Union did not stay still over the past years. It has seen some movement and some evolution. Thus, if we think of the state of affairs now, the many disagreements among the EU 27, and considering also the experience of recent years, we can be pretty confident that the temptation is pretty high to continue to muddle through from compromise to compromise on the basis of the lowest common denominator, and even that often only when our backs are firmly against the wall. But will it be enough to find our way out of this new predicament and move on more solid ground for the future? Well, that's the question. As Maya Angelou said, survival is important, but thriving is elegant. So survival matters, right? But we should be more ambitious than just to survive until the next crisis once again. And a strategy for the long run has to go beyond mere damage control. It has to include critical self-reflection on our political, economic, and social models and institutions, and willingness to challenge our economic and political practices, our health systems, our work standards, the way we communicate, I mean, you name it. Where necessary, concepts or instruments which might have served us well for a long time in the past should be reformed or should be discarded if found to be rigid and outdated, and new means and new tools should be designed to allow us to adapt and respond more effectively to the 21st century realities and imperative which we face nowadays. The second point then is to say that at present, we actually have the chance to engage in such a transformative process. And this could start with the Conference on the Future of Europe, which was announced prior to the COVID-19 crisis as a 2-year process of inclusive discussions in innovative formats about key European issues. This initiative could be used now as a stepping stone towards meaningful change in Europe. Coincidentally, we are also preparing at present for Germany to take over the presidency of the Council of the European Union in July. And as a key member state, as one of the 2 parts of the traditional engine of European integration, and as a country which can undoubtedly command more authority than most other member states, we do have a rare opportunity to get the ball rolling on a transformative process that could start with this Conference on the Future of Europe. If someone can set this in motion, I think it is the Germans. And by the way, they can also use the conference as a means, as a measure of the success of their own presidency. Final point or remark in response to your question, because we spoke of fragmentation and because we also referred to the need to move forward, I feel like we have to also touch on the issue of variable geometry, because at times differentiated integration is really the only option to advance the European project. And of course, multiple speeds are already a reality, since not all member states share the same currency, and not all are part of Schengen, not all participate in all aspects of the area of freedom, security, and justice. Some are only partially involved in the Union security and defense policy, and so on. Varying levels of cooperation and integration among the member states are already an integral part of how the EU operates, at least at times, and they are also very likely to persist in the future. For example, if now the efforts to strengthen cooperation in defense or in certain areas of migration management or in building resilience of the euro do manage to make headway. But differentiated integration should always remain the exception. It should be used in cases where more intense cooperation among a smaller group of countries or opt-outs, exempting some countries from part of the Union's acquis, can help to overcome situations where some member states are neither ready nor willing to go further, and thus they can help the EU to remain effective and cope with current and future challenges. Also, as the New Pact for Europe report that the EPC, the European Policy Center, the think tank I work for, produced some time ago, as this report argued, when differentiated cooperation occurs, and it is very likely that it will, it should, as much as possible, build on the instruments and avenues foreseen by or made legally possible under EU's primary law. For example, enhanced cooperation, PESCO, constructive abstention, opt-outs, and so on. Because the fact that these instruments are governed by clearly specified rules and constraints which are enshrined in the EU treaties minimizes the potential for negative externalities that could arise from differentiated, a more differentiated union. When that is not possible, and we have seen in the recent past that that's not always possible, for example, on the Schengen Treaty, in social policy, or in the innovations that happened during the Euro area crisis, like the Fiscal Compact, the Euro Plus Pact, the ESM, and so on. When that's not possible, then cooperation outside the framework of the EU treaties should follow the notion of what my colleagues have called an intergovernmental avant-garde, which means that the agreement is open to all member states willing to join, that it involves or even strengthens the role of EU institutions, that it refrains from setting up new separate and parallel institutional structures outside the Union, and aims to integrate the legal norms adopted and the cooperation initiated outside the EU into the treaty framework as soon as possible. So I think because this is such a likelihood in the future, then we need to bear in mind some of the details that have to be considered. I'll stop here because I think my time is up, but I'm happy to take questions and go into specific details that our public is interested in during our debate part.
Thank you very much, Corina, for sharing your ideas and views with us. I'm sure that later on, you'll be able to extend your thoughts and ideas with the questions that our audience will raise. Okay, so our next guest is Nicholas Whyte, Senior Director in APCO's Brussels office. He's got more than 2 decades of experience in international affairs, advocacy, and research. He counsels APCO's clients on ally development and coalition building, advocacy, public affairs, and strategic communication. Since joining APCO in 2014, Dr. Whyte has been leading the global solutions practice in the Brussels office, overseeing work with a strong geopolitical dimension, including APCO's work with the 2018 Bulgarian presidency of the European Union. He was also recognized in 2017 and 2018 as one of the top 40 online EU influencers on Twitter. Today, Nicholas Whyte will be speaking from Brussels. Nicholas, whenever you are ready.
Alex, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I realise that I'm the only native English speaker on this panel, so apologies if that means that I don't speak clearly enough. I know it's something that we tend to do. I'm originally from Northern Ireland, but I have been in Brussels now for 21 years. You ask if a fractured EU will survive the challenges of COVID. Sorry, I'm getting some background noise there. The EU has always survived by changing and adapting. And I think at the beginning of this crisis, we saw the sort of reassertion of state sovereignty. The EU had very little role in deciding epidemiological responses or in the closure of borders or the extent of lockdowns. But I think the EU has made itself very important in how we get out of the crisis. Both in sort of technical things like coordinated repatriation of EU nationals abroad or bulk buying of supplies and research funding for the vaccines, but of course also the recovery plan. This was not a European virus, but the recovery will be a European recovery. We still see some worrying trends in Bulgaria and Poland and Sweden. These are countries that have seemed not to have got over the hump yet. But in absolute numbers, certainly the Bulgarian and Polish situations are fairly low. The concern is that they haven't shown the sharp decline that we've seen from elsewhere. And I think, reporting on the death of Schengen, Schengen always had a slightly provisional and conditional character, and I think we're seeing indeed already a return to the previous situation. I think it's certain that health policies will now get a stronger EU dimension. At the same time, this can only ever go so far. Health provision is a local thing. In most countries, health is administered at quite a granular level. The EU probably does have a role to play in boosting the weakest while also supporting the strongest, but the main role I think is going to be as an economic enabler. I'm a bit surprised that neither of the previous speakers mentioned the coming multi-annual financial framework, the EU budget discussions. These discussions, I think, are very important, and they've been affected by the pandemic, both in content and in style. Charles Michel, the president of the EU Council, is calling an in-person meeting next month because it proved impossible to make progress via video conference. But again, I sense a very clear difference with where we were before the pandemic. It's now quite clear to me that the governments are intent in finding a solution to the budget question. That really wasn't clear in February. It wasn't clear that they were working towards a common goal. And in that sense, the pandemic has actually had the effect of helping to heal the fractures of the EU. On the conference on the future of Europe, which Corina mentioned, I think it's probably better that we didn't rush into it, and I think the outcome will probably be an improvement, simply because we had to wait a bit longer to get it going. Carme mentioned a couple of times the issue of the acceleration of internal asymmetries and inequalities, and it's a great phrase. I'm not sure that it's going to be such a visible consequence in terms of what happens in the EU, but I'd like to point to a couple of other cases where I think we are seeing precisely that acceleration. One of them is the United Kingdom. We should perhaps ask, will a fractured United Kingdom survive the challenges of COVID? The fact is that their current death rate is similar to that of EU27 as a whole. They clearly locked down rather late, so the same could be said of others, including this country. The whole crisis has become weirdly interlinked with the Brexit debate. Brexit supporters are seriously suggesting that because there will be an economic hit from Brexit and from the pandemic, that they may as well take them both together. And this is genuinely opening up the fractures within the United Kingdom. The opinion polls are showing that there is a surge in sentiment in favour of independence in Scotland. My own homeland, Northern Ireland, is moving closer to the Irish Republic, both in terms of how the pandemic is being approached, but also with the impact of Brexit, which will keep Northern Ireland within the EU customs area for several years to come. It could be that if we're having this discussion in 10 years' time, we talk about the United Kingdom in the past tense. I think also we should ask, will a fractured United States survive the challenges of COVID? The chaotic leadership of President Trump has been brutally exposed. For the first time, I am allowing myself to believe in the possibility that he might not be re-elected in November. We're seeing the internal divisions of the US order. It was very hilarious to see that the President Trump's rally in Oklahoma a few days ago was ruined by teenagers using online tools only. I wish I knew enough about China to add a third point to this, but unfortunately I don't. I want to finish with my comments on Brussels as an insider, perhaps more on style than on substance. Business in the EU has continued. The Croatian presidency fairly quickly found new working methods so that the EU did not grind to a halt. And we've actually seen progress on various bits of legislation. COREPER, the Committee of Ambassadors, has continued to meet in person every couple of days throughout the crisis. It can't go on. I mean, the fully virtual legislative process cannot go on. In-person interactions are very much more productive. And I'm personally frustrated that the networking that I enjoy and that I work hard at is currently much more difficult. I think, like all of you, I've been enjoying the distractions that we get from online get-togethers with old contacts and old friends, but it's much more difficult to make new contacts and new friends in these situations. We are seeing these restrictions gradually lifting. I also very much enjoy doing events like this live, and good heavens, Alex, I wish I was with you in Barcelona right now. So I want to thank you for your moderation of this session. Thank Albert Royo very much for this invitation. I hope I can do this in person next time, and I look forward very much to the discussion that we're about to have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for raising all these points. And you know that you are more than invited to come to Barcelona. We are certain that in autumn, we are going to start a series of sessions like this, but in real life. So I'm sure that we can do something like this in Barcelona. And as I said, all of you are more than invited to come. So having said that, now is the time to know what our viewers are concerned about. So we've been receiving some questions via social media. So now is the time for our questions and answers. Okay, so our first question is for Carme Colomina, and it goes this way. Will the 250 billion recovery package ever be passed? Do you think that the so-called Frugal Four, Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Sweden, will ever accept the concept of joint debt to finance the recovery plan supported by Germany, France, and the southern countries?
Well, I wish I know, but I think that what I think it's clear is that this package is needed. So that's already one thing. And I was mentioning at the beginning of my intervention on the differences between 2008, 9, and 2010 financial crisis. And I think that one of the differences is first that there is really this time an awareness that this is a common problem. And it didn't happen like this in 2010 when they were discussing the first rescue package for Greece. So that's already something. The second big difference from my point of view is the German engagement to this package. That's also something new, and that gives me some hopes that this package will go through. I think the big question is how will it go through? And I think that there will be some changes in the conditions. The conditions to access to this money will be strengthened, maybe more credits and less funding, but that will be part of the negotiation. And of course, that will be linked also to this financial framework that Nicholas was already mentioning, that it's always a painful discussion, that the painful negotiation that the EU goes through, and that it's coinciding in the time with both negotiations. So I think that the deal will be also part of a package.
Thanks, Karma. And then the next question is to Corina Stratulat. It goes this way. Britain will lose a lot for not being part of the EU. What does the EU construction lose or win without the UK?
Right. Well, I mean, this is a big question, and of course, to a large extent, answers have to be speculations at this point. In certain respects, it has already proven quite demanding on both sides, given the negotiations so far, and the fact that these are still ongoing, and we don't know when we will see the end of it. I'm not the expert on the Brexit, but of course we have heard, at least in the initial phases, all sorts of concerns that Brexit will fan the flames of anti-EU sentiment, will help the nationalist leaders strengthen their support basis and standing in the different EU member states, even leading to other countries, other member states wanting to take the same path as the UK. We have also heard initially concerns about Brexit maybe increasing the already important role played by Germany in the Union, and of course with the negative effect that this could heighten tensions in countries that are more suspicious of Berlin, like France. And of course, both of these concerns, for example, have not really materialized. If anything, I would argue the opposite has been the case, insofar as populists have not really become the dominant force as we thought. More countries, more member states have not held similar referenda, and of course we've recently seen that Germany and France are getting, at least in certain respects, on the same page with regard to the EU. But of course, other concerns which we still have to see whether they will materialize include the impact that Brexit could have on the euro currency system, on the budget. I mean, the UK was contributing quite a bit to the EU budget since the budget was mentioned. And another area which I can think of is that of foreign and security policy more broadly, where the UK brought quite an important contribution for the EU, but also insofar that it would affect the UK's departure would affect the EU's global standing and then soft power status, not least also with respect to the relationship with the US. All of those, I think, remains to be seen whether such concerns or such forecasts will actually prove to be valid in the future. That was just a few remarks, but I'm sure I'm not exhaustive, but Brexit is you know, an incredibly vast and intricate subject, and I cannot begin to do it justice in 2.5 minutes.
We could have another digital talk about it. Well, so the next question is for Nicholas Whyte, and it goes as it follows. Will the EU and Schengen ever recover from the COVID-19 approach of every man for himself, as country by country each EU member state shut all their fellow EU members out, as they close their borders with no central policy or even an EU task force for COVID-19 guiding them?
Short answer, yes. But I think you want me to go on a bit longer than that. You know, the fact is, as I said earlier, the crisis hit each country individually, and for that reason, we saw nation states making decisions by themselves. Schengen always foresaw that as a possibility. It's happened a number of times in the past, and it will happen a number of times in the future that countries close their borders because of a particular local situation, or indeed sometimes because of a more global situation. And we've always seen then the reversion back to the status quo. Europeans like the Schengen system. Europeans like being able to move from one country to another, and they would accept temporary restrictions in extraordinary times as we've had them, but they don't want them to go on forever. And we're seeing already, we may not have seen coordination in how the lockdowns happened, but we're seeing coordination in how it's being lifted. And there's no need for a special committee on that. The existing channels of communication between the interior ministries and other authorities are particularly robust inside the European Union. So the fact that there isn't a specific task force on this, I think, isn't especially significant. And I expect that certainly in 6 months' time, maybe a good deal sooner, we'll see a return to the status quo ante of Schengen. I just want to comment on the other two questions. I think on the budget, I agree with Carme that things are going in the right direction, and I can easily imagine how the Frugal Four could be brought off. The fact that none of them has rejected the proposal so far is itself very telling. And on Brexit, I could go on all day, but I just want to say very quickly, with Brexit, there have been no winners. And I think that's been observed by some people who might have wanted their countries to go the same way.
Thank you, Nicholas. And now the next question is for Carme Colomina. EU funds are usually given to member states, and then member states manage them as they want, what sometimes implies that they are not used for what they are meant to. As for this recovery plan, how can the European Commission make sure that funds conditionally is respected by member states? Couldn't the Commission send the funds directly to the public administration which will implement them, be a region or a city?
Yeah, well, this is part of the debate already going on in Brussels, how this money will be used. And in fact, we've seen some members of the European Parliament already implying that there shouldn't be ideological uses of this money. So that will be one of the discussions. The other one is that part of this fund that was already divided, there was a big part of the cake for the states, for the governments, but then there was also a small part that would be to companies, to enterprises, and then there was a very smaller piece that went to the research and also for the vaccine and also all kind of research and cooperation on that. So the thing is that all the member states will have to present a plan to use that money. And then there will be, again, some sort of evaluation on how it was used through the European semester, as it was already done with previous plans of rescue plans. So I think that that's so far what is on the table. And if maybe my colleagues know more about this, which is being discussed, but yeah.
Thanks, Karma. And as Karma said, if you at any time want to comment on some other's question, feel free to do it. Okay, so the next question is to Corina Stratulat. How do you think the profound differences between northern countries and southern countries will be solved?
Well, quite clearly, I don't have the magic solution or the exact answer to this question. With patience, or perhaps through the fact that the South is running a little bit out of patience with the North in the current situation. But I do want to, and of course, perhaps with some compromise as always, where each part will have to give in a little bit in order to bridge their, well, I would say mostly ideological differences than anything else. But I would want to point out two things here, that it is to a certain extent also an artificial division, since it's true that we have North and South differences, but we also have a lot of differences within countries, so and within the publics in these countries. So it is not as easy as to say that the EU is really split that way. And of course, it's not the only difference that the EU is facing. It's and it's threatening the East-West divide. Is also very much very important. So on different issues, on different policy areas, such rifts occur and will have to be bridged. And interestingly enough, they all go down to very, very fundamental structural problems that have to be resolved. What I was saying at the beginning, these are not issues that can be appeased with a little bit of money or with giving in this time. Those are a lot of the issues on which we diverge go back to problems that really need a lot of rethinking of the way we do things and of the way of our methods and instruments. And so if I have to give an answer which is quite broad, is by actually being brave to face some of the fundamental problems which we have. That's how we solve all the deep structural cleavages that exist at the moment in Europe, not only between North and South, but also East, West, and within different countries, and between national and EU level, and so on. So I will leave it at that.
Thanks, Corina. And now the next question is for Nicholas Whyte. Nicholas, do you think that the coming economic crisis will widen up the gap between the richest and the poorest EU countries?
Actually, no, I don't. That may seem a somewhat controversial and brief statement. I'll expand a little bit. First of all, the sad fact is that the richest EU countries are actually being hit somewhat worse by the virus. So in that sense, we're going to see that the gap unfortunately becomes narrower because the richest will become less rich. On top of that, I mean, it's maybe not widely enough appreciated that the EU has done a better job of improving the economies of its poorer member states than is sometimes appreciated. When Bulgaria joined the EU in 2007, its per capita gross domestic product was $10,000. Now it's 26. That's 2.5 times as much. I don't think there's another EU country that has gone up by 2.5 since 2007. Some have done quite well. Ireland almost doubled. Luxembourg has gone up quite a lot. And of course, Bulgaria also starts from a long way behind. But is the gap going to become wider because of the pandemic? No, I think not. I think we will see also that the EU budget inevitably is going to favor poorer countries over richer countries, even though, as I said, the richer countries may well have less to give.
Thanks, Nicholas. So now we are starting the third and the last round of questions. So the last question to Carme Colomina is as it follows. Why are the wealthier EU member states in Northern Europe so reluctant to aid the hardest hit and poorer member states in the South? If the worst damage from COVID-19 had happened in Sweden or Denmark or the Netherlands, would the southern EU member states have locked aid to those northern European countries?
Yeah, well, of course, for some of these governments, there is a short-term effect with this hard rhetoric on the south. Probably there is always some kind of electoral win in some member states, but I think that it's not that clear anymore, because Sweden is having a hard time now. I mean, they started very well, but they are now one with the biggest per capita numbers in Europe, so they are having a hard time. And again, Germany, and I think Chancellor Merkel has put it bluntly, the need and the responsibility to help in these pandemics. So I wouldn't say that there's such a big divide between those who want to help and those who doesn't want to. I think the divide, or the crucial point now, is on the conditions of the help. So I think that what they are insisting in some of these frugal countries, as they are called now, is what are we going to get in exchange? How are we going to control the use of money? Because it's also something that politically is well at use for them in their own countries. But I don't think that the idea is that there won't be money. So the discussion is in other terms so far.
Thanks, Karma. Then the next question is to Corina, and it goes as follows. According to the most recent Eurobarometer, Denmark is the country within the EU where people are the most satisfied with how the government has handled the corona crisis. Spain has the least satisfied population on this matter. How would you assess it?
Well, I don't have figures at hand, but I would probably link this to the general perception, public perception, and sentiment in those countries towards national governments in general. I mean, if I don't think I'm mistaken in saying that Denmark is one of the countries where trust and confidence in national government is probably one of the highest in the EU, whereas in countries like Spain, trust and confidence in government is generally lower. So this is arguably an extension and a reflection of that. Also, the effectiveness with which Denmark has dealt with coronavirus versus the scope that the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic reached in Spain obviously didn't help to improve that attitude and that sentiment and perception on the side of the public. So I think this would probably go at least some way towards explaining how people feel. And of course, we need to remember that also the first actor towards which people turned during this crisis was the state, was national government. So irrespective of whether these were populist or non-populist or irrespective of their ideological color, people did put their hope in the government having a solution and offering the way out, even when it was obvious that they didn't really help the answer to what we were going through. And so it is likely that given this interest and this the salience of governments, they would use the prism of different or previous clues that they have with respect to their sentiments, allowing those to bear on how they assess their government's handling of what has transpired during the pandemic. A guesswork, obviously, since I don't have the numbers in hand.
Okay, thanks, Corina. And the last question to Nicholas Whyte. With the upcoming departure of the UK from the EU, will more countries contemplate leaving, especially given the lack of a unified response to the pandemic?
I think I'd challenge all three legs of that question, to be perfectly honest. First of all, you ask about the upcoming departure of the UK. They actually left already on the 31st of January, so it's no longer an issue. They will leave. But it's also, as I said earlier, it's not at all clear that there have been any winners from this process. I think that in itself will have a negative demonstration effect on anybody else who wants their country to leave the EU. And I am concerned about Italy, I have to be honest. There's been some very strange rhetoric from some Italian leaders, and as was mentioned earlier, the relations between Italy and other European countries were not always well handled when the crisis was at its peak. But we have to remember that the EU's economics commissioner at the moment is a former Italian Prime Minister, Paolo Gentiloni. So I think we're going to see a lot more joined up thinking in the future than we saw at the start. And I can't imagine that any country or any serious national leader is going to look at the Brexit process and think, gosh, I must try that too. Now, then the question is whether the EU's coordination in response to the pandemic will have an effect on those decisions. I think it will have a negative effect, a cooling effect, because, as I said, we saw a bad start to the crisis. We're seeing improved communication, improved joint action, and the tipping point, I think, is going to be whether or not the budget situation is resolved moderately quickly and efficiently and smoothly. And if it is, then one hates to talk about having a good crisis, but at least we can say that it wasn't a terminal crisis, and that indeed the EU did manage to survive COVID despite its fractures.
Thank you, Nicholas. And with this last question, we get to the end of this digital talk. We are really thankful to our speakers for having been today with us. Thank you very much. It's been an honor, and we hope that the ideas and thoughts that you have shared with us can help to shed some light to this ever-present debate called Europe. And of course, we want to thank our viewers for staying again with us, and stay connected with Òmnium Cultural on our social media channels. We are planning on carrying out more initiatives like this one. And if you want to be in the loop, follow us on Twitter at Òmnium Intel. Until next time, thank you and good evening. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much.
See ya.
Bye.